I went to open my textbook. There was an image of a young Chinese man with a rope around his neck, hung, dead, just laying there. There was no warning from the professor that that imagery would be used. Not only is it a photo of murder and a photo of death, it's also a racially charged murder and death. And I think that could absolutely be triggering for people with PTSD in certain areas, for sure.
Multiple studies do suggest that trigger warnings potentially do more harm than good. And now critics argue that trigger warnings like this one right here have evolved into a catch-all phrase to protect companies grappling with heightened legal anxiety. The question is, to what end?
Must issue you a trigger warning.
You can't escape them.
If you're in doubt of whether you should give a trigger warning or not, always do.
Trigger warnings are everywhere.
Trigger warnings.
Trigger warnings.
It's even a hot topic on YouTube.
Everything about trigger warnings is really meant with the best of intentions.
A study performed by a clinical psychologist at Harvard suggests trigger warnings did not help trauma survivors brace themselves to face potentially upsetting content. In some cases, they made things worse. Another researcher added, the reason people don't get over their phobias and traumas and fears is because they don't allow themselves to be exposed to reminders.
Hi, the channel creator here. Let everyone know in the comments box below what you Homo sapiens and screen zombies think. And for fast to the point, news and information daily, subscribe, like, share, follow, do a backflip. Getting a foothold on YouTube and Rumble is impossible without your direct participation. And for a short time, it is free and will be a lifetime free membership. You will save thousands. So time is limited. Take advantage now. Don't later go to yourself, I wish I could have gotten this great channel for free. Now back to our story, folks. Hi, this video has two parts in one fast to the point report. The next video is about a study on triggering, and after that, how to get over triggering, a professional's help guide. So get that hand off the clicker or finger away from the swipper and learn something today. Trigger warnings have limited benefit for trauma survivors. They seem to increase the extent to which people see trauma as central to their identity, which can exacerbate cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, according to researchers in a recent study. Trigger warnings are meant to alert trauma survivors about unsettling text or content that they might find potentially distressing. But these words of caution at the start of films or books may provide no help at all, and might even hamper a traumatized person's ability to grapple with deep psychological scars, a new study reports. We found that trigger warnings did not help trauma survivors brace themselves to face potentially upsetting content, said lead researcher Peyton Jones, a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at Harvard University. In some cases, they made things worse. Trigger warnings seem to increase the extent to which people see trauma as central to their identity, which can exacerbate cases of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, in the long run, Jones and his colleagues found. We found evidence that trigger warnings increased the extent to which trauma survivors saw their worst event as central to their life story, Jones said. Seeing trauma as central to one's life is not a good thing. The study's results are strong enough that they should provoke some real soul-searching about who's really being helped by trigger warnings, said Guy Boyson, a professor of psychology at McKendree University in Lebanon, Illinois. It's a pretty convincing argument that in the population that trigger warnings are supposed to be for, it's not really doing much, Boyson said. It's time in this research area to flip the question and ask not whether trigger warnings work, but is there any population in which they do anything? Previous studies on trigger warnings have had similar findings but have been criticized because participants were from the general public and not specifically people with a history of trauma, said Boyson, an expert on the topic. The concept of trigger warnings evolved from work on PTSD, a condition in which reminders of trauma cause some to experience extreme emotional reactions, Boyson said. Online discussion groups for survivors of sexual trauma came up with the idea of providing warnings in advance. so people could talk about their experiences without causing pain in others, the researchers said in background notes. Since then, the concept has flourished. About half of all college professors told National Public Radio in a 2025 survey that they'd used trigger warnings to prepare students for potentially difficult material. However, the practice has been adopted without any real research to confirm whether it actually helps, Jones said. To test the effectiveness of trigger warnings, the researchers recruited 600 people who'd been exposed to a traumatic event, actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. Participants were split into two groups. Both read a series of literature passages that ranged from neutral to mildly distressing to markedly distressing. The only difference was that one group received trigger warnings prior to reading distressing passages, while the other did not. Participants rated their emotions after finishing each passage and also completed a series of psychological questionnaires at the end. Overall, both groups appeared to react similarly to the passages. Neither seemed to be spared the emotional impact of reading the text, the researchers said. But people given trigger warnings were more likely to express the belief that their trauma is an essential part of a survivor's life story, something that won't help them overcome their trauma, Jones said. According to Boyson, avoidance is bad. The reason people don't get over their phobias and traumas and fears is because they don't allow themselves to be exposed to reminders of them or the things themselves, and that just increases their symptomology. Jones said the report is one of the very first studies to test whether trigger warnings work as intended. The key takeaway for me is not that trigger warnings are bad, but that for many years we have been implementing a policy for trauma survivors without testing whether it is actually helpful or harmful. Boyson suggested that trigger warnings might not work as intended because there's simply no way to make them specific enough in a general setting. He gave the example of a person who has been robbed at gunpoint in their own home by burglars. What is the trigger going to be for that? Is it going to be seeing a person who looks like that? Is it going to be talking about guns, talking about robbery? It could be anything, right? Boyson said. The triggers for things that might lead to automatic distress are so diverse and so individualized, it's impossible to predict in a general way what's going to be triggering for people, because it's 100% totally unique to that person, Boyson added. While generalized trigger warnings don't appear to help, Boyson said they still could be useful on an individual basis. For example, if a student with a solid grasp of their trauma trigger lets a professor know in advance what type of content could cause distress. That's a different thing because the teacher then has more of a specific idea of what could be effective. Now set down your phone and go out and experience a screen-free life. The concept of being triggered, though it may at times be overused, sits on top of a hugely important concept in psychological life, which demands our respect, compassion, and attention. To be triggered is, in its most basic form, to respond with intense fear and anger to a situation in the here and now, which, to other people, may seem blameless and unconcerning. One moment we are calm, the next we are catapulted into despair and terror. Only minutes ago, the future looked hopeful. Now only ruin and disaster seem to lie ahead. Most of us who suffer from these episodes would very much like to better hold on to equanimity and hope. It may be important to know how to be scared or incensed when situations actually demand it, but the triggered person typically feels after an episode. It is also deeply counterproductive and plain exhausting to be visited by powerful emotions that aren't warranted by what lies before us and that fail to advance our interests in any way. The way out of being uncontrollably triggered is to understand how the mechanism operates. The mind is triggered when it believes it recognizes in the world around it a situation that it feels from memory to be highly damaging and dangerous. Our triggers are a secret guide to our histories. They tell us about things we were once very afraid of. The triggering element is like a piece of a jigsaw that will precisely fit into an analogous puzzle in the past. We are triggered now by what we were devastated by then. Even if we don't remember too much about our past, we can surmise everything we need to know from reverse engineering our triggers. If we are constantly afraid we are going to be excommunicated and mocked, this will, in some form, be exactly what happened to us at some stage long ago. If we're terrified that someone is going to overpower us and not listen to our no's, this is an almost sure echo of what we once experienced. The precise relationship between trigger and catalytic event may not always be literally equivalent. There can be some displacement along the way, but the link will be strong all the same. The trigger contains and maps onto a traumatic event. Let's imagine a person who is triggered, that is, thrown into powerful despair and self-loathing by images on social media of blatantly attractive and popular people. No sooner have they seen these than they start to doubt and despise themselves. Reflect on their inadequacies and remember all the reasons why they are fated to be a failure and unloved. The trigger is not entirely nothing. There is something a little dispiriting about the beauty parade on certain sorts of social media, but the point at issue is the scale of the reaction that is generated. In seeking to account for it, we have to look backwards. The person has been triggered because the contemporary event contains, in a garbled, disguised and unconscious form, the essence of a profoundly traumatic dynamic in earlier life, which lies mostly unknown and unexplored, and thereby commands immense and unending power over the victim. Let's suppose that this person had a mother who favored their more ebullient younger sibling over them, and that their looks were part of what damned them to horrific neglect and emotional coldness. It doesn't, in the circumstances, take much to be returned back to this place. We are animals who are primed to sniff out in the present the slightest sign of the dangers of the past. The tragedy of triggering is that it fails to notice the differences between then and now, between the awfulness we suffered long ago and the relative innocence of the modern moment. Insofar as bad things do happen nowadays, triggering also fails to account for the way in which we are no longer children, and are therefore able to respond to the threats that do come our way with a lot more creativity, strength, and calm than we possessed as 4 or 10-year-olds. Were things ever to get as bad as they once were, we have so many more options than we did, and therefore so many reasons to feel less agitated and vulnerable. To be triggered is to lose our powers of discrimination. In the heat of the moment, we can no longer distinguish between A and B. So frightening is A that everything between it and Q is, at heart, another A. We can't tell that someone is not telling us that we are guilty, that the situation isn't evidence of doom, that we are not being mocked, that our colleague isn't attacking us, that we aren't being reprimanded unbearably, that we haven't been told we're an idiot or a monster. We can't distinguish between looking a bit tired and looking fundamentally unacceptable, between something they've done that got them sent to prison, and something we've done that won't ever be noticed. So primed has our history made us to appalling scenarios, we have no ability not to refine them at every turn, especially when we are a little low or tired. Though we might assume that we'd want to escape our triggers, we are also drawn to them through a compulsive sense of familiarity. Calm and confidence aren't our resting places. They don't feel normal and are therefore worrying in their own way. We want our awful hunches confirmed. It can feel right to put ourselves in environments where people might be mocking, to look out for stories of disgrace or ruin, or to befriend people who are constantly on the edge of undermining us. When our mood feels eerie and sad, we might go to the very website that triggers us or call up the person we know is going to alarm us. The cure for triggering is love. Love understood as a process of patiently holding someone and, like a kindly and soothing parent, helping them to discriminate between black and white, terror and calm, evil and goodness. The cure lies too in learning to work backwards from our current triggers to the dynamics that once created them. Rather than worrying yet more about the future, we should ask ourselves the simple question, what does my fear of what will happen tell me about what did happen? What scenario from my past is contained in my alarm at the future? To overcome our triggers is to come to navigate the present with all the confidence and excited curiosity that should have been ours from the start. And maturity could be defined as knowing what triggers us and why, and a commitment to dampening our first responses in the name of a patient exploration and understanding of the past.
Hard basis. Fast and to the point news and information daily.